In the beginning of weapon history, there was the word, and very little more. Then progress set in. Through the centuries, man has increased the effective range and efficiency of his weapons as rapidly as his science would permit.
Having them makes peace more secure.
Они открыто провозглашают планы развязывания ядерной войны. Эту борьбу мы не можем ослабить ни на один день. И будем вести ее до тех пор, пока опасность не будет отодвинута, пока не будет обеспечен точный мир.
It is time for us to start a build-up, a rebuilding of the military might of America. And it is time for us to build that to the point that no other nation on this earth will ever dare raise a hand against us, and in this way we will preserve world peace, and we're the only ones who can do it.
On August the 7th, 1945, President Truman announced the atomic bombing of Hiroshima with these words. The experiment, he said, has been an overwhelming success. 3 days later, the destruction of Nagasaki was officially described as having achieved good results. These announcements, and especially the words used, experiment, success, good results, to describe the unique and horrific carnage of nuclear war, were the first public examples of a new kind of propaganda. By using reassuring, even soothing language, language which allowed both the politicians and us to distance ourselves from the horror of nuclear war, this new kind of propaganda created acceptable images of war and the illusion that we could live securely with nuclear weapons. Even those first two bombs on Japan had nice comic book names, Little Boy and Fat Man, and soon bombs were no longer bombs at all, but devices and hardware, with names like Mule and Sow and Little Bambi. Bigger and more lethal weapons were called modernized systems. Above all, we were conditioned to accept a so-called strategy for possessing nuclear weapons called deterrence, which no one could explain rationally, and which blurred the fact that a massive nuclear arms race was well underway. For 15 years of this arms race, up to 1980, the British Parliament did not once debate nuclear weapons. Such was a secrecy aimed not so much at a potential enemy, but at the British people. It was all very simple. Our side were simply the good guys of the West, and the other side were the bad guys, a dark threat, seldom portrayed in human terms. Surely, what has been overlooked is that we are a democracy, unlike the Soviet Union, and that in a democracy, secrecy and propaganda ought not to control how we think, especially in matters of national survival, and that principle is assumed throughout this documentary. Today, for many of us, the unthinkable, nuclear war, has become the thinkable, although we may not be aware that we have been led across this threshold. Today we are guided by new reassuring words, like theatre nuclear war and limited nuclear war. That is, a nuclear war limited to Europe, a nuclear war in which victory is possible. But victory for whom? The good guys or the bad guys? Today, in nuclear weapons, there is the equivalent of 4 tons of TNT for every human being. enough to wipe us out 30 times? Or is it 50 times? The official truth, or propaganda, is that the deterrence of this nuclear arsenal has given us a generation of peace. The unofficial truth is that a total of 36 countries now either have the bomb or the capacity to build it, and that nuclear war between the superpowers has never been closer. The nuclear arms race began with the war against Germany. In 1939, the physicist Albert Einstein urged President Roosevelt to speed up uranium research because he feared a German atomic bomb. Under J. Robert Oppenheimer, scientists were assembled at Los Alamos in New Mexico, their assignment to build an atomic bomb. This was the Manhattan Project. By 1944, special Allied agents, codenamed Alsos, had proved beyond doubt that Germany did not possess an atomic bomb. This vital information was classified top secret. It meant, in effect, there was no longer a need to build the bomb. But the military head of the Manhattan Project, General Leslie Groves, was obsessed by one consuming fear, that the war would be over before his bomb was ready. Even after Germany surrendered, Groves said, "We must not lose a single day, for there was still Japan." A rebellion broke out among leading scientists. Einstein and Leo Szilard sent a petition to the White House pleading for the bomb not to be used. But this was still on Roosevelt's desk when he died in April 1945. The distortion of language, thought and culture was now well underway. The word bomb was not used. Officially it was a gadget, and the first explosion was to be called a trinity. And if this bomb was successful, it would be called a boy, and if it failed, a girl. Partly to cover up the growing dissent from Einstein, Szilard and others, which might have stopped the atomic age, Oppenheimer and his inner circle on the Manhattan Project were asked to become propagandists. In this remarkable propaganda film, they act out the last minutes before the first test explosion.
The automatic controls got it now. Rob, this time the stakes are really high.
It's going to work all right, Robert, and I'm sure we'll never be sorry for it.
Minus 10 seconds. Minus 5 seconds. Now!
Incredibly, dance band music was played, and an official report rushed to President Truman said, "The explosion had a beauty that cannot be described, the beauty great poets dream about." 21 days later, a plane called the Enola Gay took off for Hiroshima, in spite of the fact that the Americans had broken the Japanese code and knew the war was all but over. Military Intelligence Director Alfred McCormack said later, "We were secretly mining their harbors, we had command of their skies, but still the bomb was dropped." Daily Express correspondent Wilfred Burchett was the first Western journalist to reach Hiroshima after 80,000 people had died in the first nuclear fire.
First of all, I'd seen plenty of bombed cities during World War II, but this was a very eerie thing. At first I thought there was nothing left at all. It just seemed as if, I think as I expressed it in the story I wrote at the time, as if it had been a city steamrolled out of existence. There was not rubble in the normal sense of the term. There was dust that had been pulverized. A city that was red dust where there had been brick. There was grey dust where there had been concrete. It seemed to me that there couldn't possibly have been any survivors at all, because all was a great waste. People were, they were really dazed. Nobody stopped to speak to anybody else. They were human beings, but you felt that somehow or other they'd become dehumanized human beings. They were sort of robots. Occasionally people were scratching away with their hands in ruins to try to find some bits of family possessions.
Burchett was on his own, while other reporters were being closely shepherded by public relations officers. Victims were carefully avoided. Hospitals were off limits.
A bunch of correspondents arrived. They were Washington correspondents who were flown out and were assured they would be the first ones to visit Hiroshima. And I met this group, and the public relations officer in charge of them were furious to find that there was a correspondent already wandering around. And he actually held a sort of a press conference, a press briefing for his colleagues in Hiroshima at the prefecture. And he dwelt exclusively on the great success of the bomb and the great power of the bomb, dealt with the physical effects of the bomb, but none of those correspondents visited the hospital. None of them, they were not interested. I mean, they were briefed not to be interested in what actually happened to the victims. So the question of radiation sickness was absolutely suppressed.
It is not surprising that Burchett's story was publicly denied. For 3 times as many people died in the 5-year period after the bomb fell on Hiroshima than on the day of the explosion, most of them from the effects of radiation. What we in the West got used to seeing was physical damage in Hiroshima. Even film of what really happened to the victims was suppressed. The film on the right of the screen represents what we mostly saw on newsreel and television right up to 1968. This film was shot by Japanese cameramen in the only hospitals operating. The Japanese film was confiscated and shipped to Washington, where it was classified secret and not released for 23 years.
The deputy head of the hospital, Dr. Katsube, explained to me, specifically, we don't know what we're dealing with. People come in, the symptoms are standard symptoms of dizziness, loss of appetite, hemorrhage, internal hemorrhage, diarrhea, and then later there are spots, and there are the final stage before death is the hair falling out and bleeding from the nose, from the mouth. And the symptoms are similar to that of acute vitamin deficiency. Whatever we had available, we started giving vitamin injections. But where we put the needle in, then the flesh rotted.
The first target in Japan, decided a secret Manhattan Project committee, should be one that has escaped earlier bombardments, so that the effect of a single atomic bomb can be ascertained. Official truth? The bomb was dropped to end the war. Unofficial truth? It was an experiment. In Tokyo, the military held a press conference to deny Burchett's story about the new dangers of radiation.
The officer giving the press conference was Brigadier General Thomas Farrell, who was Deputy Director to General Groves, who was in charge of the Manhattan Project. And he was denying flatly that there was any such thing as atomic radiation, that people were suffering from this. He conceded that maybe the people that are dead there, they have died through bomb and through blast effects. He said there may be a few who suffered from radiation from the gamma rays released at the time of the explosion. That's normal. But there are no residual radiation effects. There can be no residual radiation effects. The bomb was exploded at sufficient height to avoid that. I assured him what I'd seen in the hospitals and what they had told me in the hospital, that people who had not even been in Hiroshima were dead and were dying. In the end, all I can assume is you formed the victims of the Japanese propaganda.
In fact, for all of Japan, the rate of leukemia suddenly increased by 50% and stayed at that level until the 1950s, although this was not reported at the time. The official truth was quite different, and even as propaganda was extraordinary. Here, in the New York Times, the War Department denies categorically that the bomb produced dangerous radioactivity. Today in Japan they are still dying. This is the atomic bomb hospital in Hiroshima, where last year, as every year, more than 1,000 people died from cancers resulting from that one bomb. In 1945, the unthinkable was acted upon. As a result, perhaps 500,000 Asians have died, often slow and terrible deaths. What is truly unthinkable is that it now might happen to us. This was America after the Second World War, victorious and rich and untouched by war. This was Russia at the same time, victorious and utterly devastated. In 1946, former Vice President Henry Wallace revealed that he had warned President Roosevelt that the US military were planning what he called a preventative atomic strike against the Soviet Union. In 1949, a Russian bomb was exploded and arms technology soon dominated both American and Soviet economies. In America today, the military-industrial complex helps to keep alive some 22,000 major corporations. New weapons mean an endless cycle of competition and profit. In the Soviet Union, the military is the most modern and national and respected of all institutions, to which much of the nation's resources are mortgaged. In both countries, nuclear weapons like space technology are linked in the public mind with national prestige and progress.
Over here on the floor is a Poseidon missile. That one happens to come from the James Madison. And this one is going to be replaced by the new Trident that's just being built. They have a much longer range than the Poseidon over here. They will have a range of about 4,000 miles, I think. Now, if you will come over here, I will show you how we launched the men to the moon.
This process of conditioning us to accept nuclear weapons and a nuclear arms race really got underway with a lie called the missile gap. The missile gap dominated headlines in the late 50s and 60s, especially following the launch of the Russian Sputnik, the first satellite into space in October 1957. And hysteria swept over the three American services. Sputnik, they said, proved that the Russians were ahead in missile technology. But this was not true. Indeed, the very notion of a missile gap was ridiculous, as every American scientist working on missiles now concedes. Dr. Herbert York, one of the most distinguished and key figures in the early development of nuclear weapons, wrote this in his book Race to Oblivion. By 1955, the principal inter-service battle had become a power struggle over who would get the juiciest and sexiest roles and missions in long-range missiles. When Sputnik went up, each of the services hoped to take advantage of the public confusion and consternation over Sputnik.
Sputnik did not really represent a big technological lead on the part of the Soviets. The two programs at the fundamental level, that is the American missile program, missile and space program, the Soviet missile and space program, were rather evenly balanced. In fact, the American program was bigger and somewhat ahead in terms of technological base, but the Russians put up the first satellite, and so for the man in the street, that was what counted, and not more detailed questions about what the technological, how the two technological bases compared.
As a result, an unprecedented missile building program began in the United States. This arms race was fueled by intelligence reports which credited the Russians with all kinds of technological wonders, including an elusive atomic-powered bomber. Again, to quote Dr. York, "Today it is quite obvious that no such nuclear aircraft ever existed in the Soviet Union, and that stories to that effect were simply one more very clear attempt to generate what may be called self-serving intelligence." Admiral Jean LaRocque, United States Navy, was number 2 at Strategic Plans Division in the Pentagon. That means he was a senior nuclear strategist. Before that, he was Admiral commanding the Mediterranean Nuclear Task Group.
We have been 3 to 5 years ahead of the Soviet Union in the development of every strategic weapons system that has come down the pike since we developed and exploded the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the hydrogen bomb. We deployed our ICBMs first. We had the first jet aircraft to carry the bombs to the Soviet Union, the first nuclear-powered submarines, the first solid propellant missiles in our submarines. We went to MERV 10 years before the Soviets came up with their multiple independent re-entry vehicles.
When you say that the United States is 3 to 5 years ahead, that flies in the face of everything that we've heard from the White House, from Whitehall, everything our governments tell us.
Well, you just have to look at the facts, John. We have more strategic nuclear weapons than the Soviets have. We have 9,200 today. The Soviets, at the highest estimate by our government, is 7,000 strategic nuclear weapons. We have a bomber force of about 400 strategic bombers, all of them very fast, jet-propelled aircraft, the F-111s and the B-52s. The Soviets have only 140 strategic bombers, and of that, 100 are still old propeller planes. We have most of our nuclear weapons at sea, where they're secure. We have 5,000 nuclear weapons in our submarines. And we keep 3,000 nuclear weapons off the Soviet Union, day in and day out, and have done so for 20 years. The Soviets, on the other hand, have only 1,000 nuclear weapons in all of their submarines, and they keep 200 nuclear weapons off of the U.S. coast. By every criterion that you can think of, the United States is ahead today in absolute terms, and we're building in such a way that we are going to stay ahead, no matter what the Soviets do.
Professor Lawrence Freedman is head of war studies at King's College London and formerly with the Royal Institute of International Affairs.
I think most people would accept that in quantity of military power, whether one's talking about conventional or nuclear forces, the Soviet Union has more numbers. It, say, has 1,400 ICBMs to the American 1,000. With multiple warheads. The Americans may have more warheads at the moment, but they're losing that lead too. So I don't think the argument is quantity. Quality is relevant. The United States certainly has been the pace setter in some ways on quality. But even then, I think the qualitative differences are not as great as they once were. The Soviet Union has, with enormous effort, caught up, and it's very proud of doing so.
For impartial analysis, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute enjoys a rare reputation. Its 1982 report says that America is up to 5 years ahead of Russia.
We believe in the Russian army. We believe in the skill of the Russian generals.
Birmingham, where in the shadow of the Queen Victoria statue and beneath the red flag, a vast crowd listens to a fighting speech by Lord Beaverbrook.
And we believe in Stalin's leadership. Yes, in Stalin's leadership.
I'm very, very glad to have met you. Very glad indeed.
Official truth, or propaganda, often depends on the image of a people whom our government wants us to regard as an enemy in order to justify its own foreign policies. As Lord Beaverbrook, wartime cabinet minister under Churchill, made clear, the Russians then were good Russians. Now take, for example, the Germans. These were bad Germans, although they were the same people as Willy Brandt's good West Germans, who live next to their communist countrymen in the East, who are, officially, bad Germans. All this may sound ridiculous, and it is. But conditioning us to fear and mistrust an entire nation of human beings is vital if we are to regard them as a threat. Remember the bad Chinese, the Red Guards, the Yellow Peril? Weren't they then the embodiment of the evil threat? And what are they now? Now, they're the good Chinese. When I last went to the Soviet Union in 1977, I interviewed many of those called dissidents, people who dared to speak out in a police state. Simple Democrats, you might call them, like the courageous Volodya Slepak, now in prison, and Irina Ginsburg, now in the West with her husband, Alexander Ginsberg. What I learned from these people was this. When international tension is relaxed, détente we used to call it, the Soviet bureaucracy finds it more difficult to justify open repression. And as a result, there is a dialogue, private and cautious certainly, but a dialogue on matters of war and peace, and in a country ever mindful that 22 million of its people died in the last war. Eventually this dialogue finds an echo in the Soviet leadership, burdened by military spending and unable to feed its own people without imported American grain. When tension is relaxed, these reformist elements have influence, and the result has been a partial test ban treaty and strategic arms limitations. But when the West rattles its missiles, there is no dialogue and no echoes, only a state of siege, only danger. In the 1950s, at the height of the old Cold War, John Foster Dulles, then American Secretary of State, said, "In order to make people bear the burden, we have to create an emotional atmosphere akin to a wartime psychology. We must create the idea of a threat from without. The manipulation of statistics, sometimes known as disinformation, is one way of creating this wartime psychology."
If you read a statement by the American Secretary of Defense about the number of Soviet divisions in Eastern Europe, you'd probably take that as a hard fact. And if you read a statement actually issued in the same month by the chairman of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff about the number of Soviet divisions in Eastern Europe, you'd probably take that as a hard fact. And when you found out the Secretary of Defense said there were 31 Soviet divisions there, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said there were 27, which was what they said in 1978, then you start by realizing there are no agreed facts.
Can you develop that from those diagrams with the tanks lined up against each other? Now, what's been left out of those?
The age of the tanks, for example. Some of the Warsaw Pact tanks are nearly 30 years old, much older than NATO tanks.
So they're not as efficient?
They're not as efficient. They break down more easily. They don't have as powerful guns. Their guns aren't as accurate. They can't fire on the move and all other kinds of questions like that. Anti-tank weapons are left out. NATO has got about 250,000 anti-tank guided weapons, and it's got numerous other weapon systems which are capable of destroying tanks with quite extraordinary and really rather nasty efficiency. And so if you see this comparison of tanks, I suppose the first question to say is, are these facts? For example, if you compare the number of tanks, that in a sense is a half-truth, because you must throw in the number of anti-tank weapons when you're making that kind of comparison. From half-truths one moves on to distortions, and from distortions one goes on to downright lies.
In 1979, a secret committee of NATO decided to base 572 American cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe. 160 of these would be based in Britain, mostly here at Greenham Common, near Newbury. The official truth was that the cruise missiles would balance Russia's SS-20 missiles, which are aimed at Western Europe. The unofficial truth is that the cruise was designed for a nuclear war in Europe and will be controlled by the United States. Parliament was never consulted, nor were local people who received this Ministry of Defense brochure.
This is the soft sell for nuclear weapons,
Yeah.
and as you may know, 96 cruise missiles are coming to Greenham Common.
Yes.
So this is a brochure by which they try to persuade local people that they should welcome this new development.
But of course they say that in a time of tension, as they put it, the crews will be moved around, and that the Russians really won't strike Greenham Common and Newbury.
That is the whole rationale for them of siting crews here. But for us, I mean, there is the problem of actually transporting these things, even if that should happen, and clearly there's the risk of accident. But more importantly, since they made that statement, we now know that one flight of cruise missiles is to be permanently armed when on the base.
With nuclear weapons?
Oh, indeed, and they are building super-hardened silos in order to protect those armed weapons. So we think it's a nonsense that they will be moved around. When they feel that they ought to tell the people something, then the propaganda is extremely crude. just as crude as one might think it would be in the USSR. And this is a blatant example of that.
In January 1980, Francis Pym, then Defence Secretary, reassured people living near the bases that the cruise missiles in no way endangered them. From the air, one can see clearly just how close danger would be. In September 1980, a civil defence exercise was carried out based on what British intelligence understood would happen in a nuclear attack. The first 3 nuclear bombs fell here. Greenham Common and Newbury were wiped out.
When I first saw this, I noticed the subtitle, which is a vital part of the West's life insurance. And it struck me that I was being sold a life insurance policy. And I suppose, in a sense, the thing to do is, as one does with any advertising that one's thinking about carefully, if you want to buy a life insurance policy, you really start asking some hard questions about it and take that package apart. To begin with, it's headed the balance of longer-ranged, land-based theatre nuclear forces. I want to know why they're only talking about land-based forces. Britain has got its Polaris submarines, the French, if one were to count them in, have got their submarine-launched missiles, and the Americans have earmarked 40 to 45 missiles carrying 400 warheads to NATO's use, which should be included in this category.
Well, I think it's quite simple, really. It's expected that the ordinary member of the public will look at these tall pink blocks, USSR, and the low blue blocks, NATO, and come to the conclusion that NATO is miles behind the USSR. But this is only one category of weapons, and so this is an extremely dishonest presentation.
And then when I look and see that on the NATO side they have referred to just 2 types of aircraft, when in fact based in Western Europe there are half a dozen types which are capable of dropping nuclear weapons on the Soviet Union, then this really does become rather a worthless piece of advertising. I regard this as quite low-quality propaganda.
The brochure also says nuclear weapons have been stored in this country for many years, and at no time has one been involved in an accident. In July 1956, a United States B-47 crashed into an atomic bomb store at Lakenheath Base in Suffolk. Roads jammed with people escaping in panic from the base. President Eisenhower ordered all mention of nuclear weapons cut from the accident report at the time. 23 years later, a retired American general said that part of eastern England almost became an atomic desert. Today, nothing has changed at Lakenheath. It is still a nuclear base.
It also says there's been no leak of radiation. Not far from where we're standing is Aldermaston, where there have been leaks of radiation, and where indeed 70 people are known to be contaminated as a result of working on nuclear warheads.
We can't use that cruise missile in the United States. We can only use the land-based cruise missile in Europe. We fought World War I in Europe. We fought World War II in Europe. And most of the Americans would like to fight World War III in Europe if we have to fight another world war. The United States, for many years, really since World War II, has had this concept of a forward-based system. We want to keep a forward-based system in the United Kingdom, Europe, Southern Europe, that whole tier, so that if we do become involved in a war with the Soviets, we can fight the war there and not fight the war in the United States.
Britain has more foreign bases on its soil than most countries, all of them American and many of them Soviet nuclear targets, according to British and Soviet information. At Lakenheath, walls are 2 feet thick with special air filters to protect their American personnel from radioactive dust. Hardly any of these American bases are directly committed to the defense of Britain. Instead, they are here to provide America's front line. Now let's play a new television game called Find the Missing Bases. In June 1980, Bob Cryer, the Labour MP, asked the then Defence Secretary Francis Pym to provide a total list of American bases in Britain. Mr. Pym obliged with a round dozen, so our score is 12. But there were, he added, a few storage, logistics support, communications facilities. So a month later, Mr. Pym was asked to list these extra bases, and the dozen suddenly grew to 53. Then, a month later, Mr. Pym was asked to list any omissions from his 2 earlier lists. Well, yes, there were 3 more bases, including, as it happens, the largest American underwater spy base in the world. So that makes 56. But that wasn't all. The journalist Duncan Campbell of the New Statesman found and listed another 47 bases, making a grand total of 103. That's a long way from Mr. Pym's dozen. This is the Ministry of Defence in London, where we have sought cooperation in making this documentary. We did get permission to film at 3 British installations, and a Ministry public relations man offered us government film, some of it 14 years old. The British public, he said with a laugh, would not know the difference. I asked to interview the Secretary of State, Mr. Nott, but this was refused. Instead, I was offered what is called an unattributable briefing. Sorry, I've broken rule number 1 in telling you that. As my colleagues and I were led upstairs by the public relations man, Mr. Ian MacDonald of Falklands fame, Mr. MacDonald laid out the rules. You cannot, he said, name the man you're about to see. You cannot report to anyone what he tells you. You cannot say it came from the government. You cannot say it came from a Whitehall source, or a NATO source, or a Western source. Later I asked him, are you saying this briefing did not happen? You've got it, he replied. Fylingdale's early warning base in Yorkshire, where they are trained to give us an early warning of a nuclear attack. 3 times a week they play a game here which seems to be called Confidence High. The people at Fylingdale's refer to it as the all-singing, all-dancing show. If the game had been a reality, there would now be about 8 minutes to impact of the first nuclear bomb to hit Britain.
High test details, bearing 060, range 800 miles.
UK Ellen Isaac.
This is the SPO. Confidence report now. Confidence report now.
MIP confidence high, sir. My confidence high.
Thank you. High all air check. Confidence high. Inform missile warning. Inform centers.
Hello, missile warning. This is Fylingdale's. We have an IRBM in the system, and our confidence is high.
This is the SPO. Confidence report.
Roger, Whiskey Echo Echo.
UK senders informed.
Missile warning informed, sir.
Thank you.
"5 minutes to impact. All they can do is wait. And in all probability, we would know nothing about it. Early morning London, now only 1 minute to impact. A child of Hiroshima wrote, "It was a nice day. I was playing outdoors when I saw a sudden flash. Fire broke out everywhere. Our house and gate were burned down before I knew it. Then we went under a bridge. There were many people there dying from burns. When I came back, Daddy was dead. A few days later, Mummy died too. My sister and I cried to ourselves." This diagram, inspired by the book London After the Bomb, shows you second by second how London would be destroyed. Immediately after detonation, a flash of light will blind anyone looking at it. Within 3 seconds, clothes are burned off, all exposed skin is charred. Within 12 seconds, there are winds of up to 200 miles an hour. Cars are tossed about like toys, and people like dolls. Survivors are crushed or trapped inside their houses. As far away as 8 miles, people are blinded and receive second-degree burns. And this is the effect of only a 1 megaton bomb. and such a small bomb, it has been calculated, will make a crater large enough to swallow 10 Wembley stadiums. Of course, the only real evidence we have are the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
The whole city was on fire. Their faces were so badly burnt, it was impossible to tell whether they were men or women.
I noticed my face was swelling, getting so big I couldn't see, and my hands swelling like balloons. I couldn't grasp anything, couldn't reach the children.
We looked for survivors, dragging them from the wreckage, but their skin was so badly burned, it was actually melting. Limbs came away in our hands.
Got it all a-going, got my savings growing, got the Abbey habit with Abbey National. Got something behind me now, got it growing safely now, got the Abbey habit with Abbey National.
Nuclear war is becoming big business, a rare growth area. Indeed, you can now get a building society mortgage for a fallout shelter. Unfortunately, there is no guarantee that it will work. Some people, of course, won't need a mortgage because we have already paid for their shelter.
Well, going right there, isn't it? Going
What about us?
Beneath these flats is a nuclear bunker in South London, typical of cosy bunkers throughout Britain. It is not for the use of people living in the flats, which will collapse in a nuclear attack. Of course, the bunker is designed not to collapse and is only for police, military, and public servants. The government's published civil defence plans, called Protect and Survive, tell you to tape up the handles of your toilet and get in lots of tin soup and put your head in a bag. Like being snowed in at Christmas, nuclear war sounds almost fun. However, there are no evacuation plans, and this means that most of the population is to be sacrificed and that the establishment will outlive the people. Parks, commons, even your local golf course have been secretly designated areas for mass graves. What all this reveals is that civil defence is simply a propaganda term and that preparing us for war is the real aim.
The most widespread danger from nuclear explosions is fallout. Fallout is dust that is sucked up from the ground by the explosion. Fallout can kill. Since it can be carried for great distances by the winds, it can eventually settle anywhere. So no place in the United Kingdom is safer than any other.
In this Home Office film, the buildings are miraculously untouched, and of course nothing looks like Hiroshima. Its main aim is to pacify us and to keep us literally in our place.
Stay where you are. If you leave your home, your local authority may take it over for homeless families. And if you move, the authorities in the new place will not help you with food, accommodation, or other essentials. You are better off in your own home. Stay there.
A Home Office circular to local authorities states that the first aim of civil defence is to control public dissent. With a nuclear attack imminent, the Cabinet will approve Queen's Order 2, the suspension of Parliament and democracy. In the Police Manual of Home Defence, a restricted document, priority is given before an attack to detention or restriction of movement of subversive or potentially subversive people. Lowest on the list is advice to the rest of the population on how to survive. This is the Land Battle Tactics Manual of the British Armed Forces for the year 1960. On page 12 it says this: nuclear weapons of varying yields will be used in large but not unlimited numbers. In other words, the planning for a limited nuclear war in Europe began at least 22 years ago. But haven't we been led to believe that nuclear war as a practical military option is only a recent development? And was there any debate at the time in Parliament and the press? No, there was not. It says here, restricted. The information given in this document is not to be communicated either directly or indirectly to the press or to any person not authorized to receive it. And that meant almost everybody. Except, of course, the generals who play war games every autumn.
You are NATO's fire brigade, ready to assemble and move on short notice to either flank, to act as our alliance's collective deterrent force during those ambiguous days of rising tension. When you and your comrades return to your bases, you should be able to look back with pride. Pride in your performance, pride in your unit's achievements, and pride that you in the military uniform of your country serve the most noble of causes, the preservation of peace with freedom for your countrymen. Good luck, man. Have a good and a safe exercise.
Through early morning fog I see visions of the things to be, the pains that are withheld for me. I realize and I can see that suicide is painless. It brings on many changes, and I can take or leave it if I please. The game of life is hard to play. Gonna lose it anyway. The losing card I'll someday lay. So this is all I have to say. Suicide is painless. Suicide. It brings on many changes. And I can take or leave it if I please.
Welcome to the integrated battlefield, a new improved concept in war. Now, if you don't know what that means, well, neither do I. It's what the military call this battlefield in Germany, where a limited nuclear and chemical war is at present being fought. Remember, it's only a limited nuclear war. The enemy are, of course, those evil non-people, the Russians, and their Warsaw Pact allies, including the bad Germans. These are known in this war as the Orange Forces. Our side are the Americans and their NATO allies, including the British and the good Germans, and these are known as the Blue Forces. Now, in this limited nuclear war, nasty old-fashioned terms of death and destruction have been done away with, and not before time. Horrible bombs are now systems. Soldiers are human assets. Civilians, that's innocent bystanders, are now called support structure. And dead civilians, always a rather emotive term, have been replaced with collateral damage, that old favorite from Vietnam. This morning, both nuclear and chemical systems were activated without degradation. That means they are fired without a hitch. And all the human assets, that's the soldiers, changed into their protective noddy suits. Noddy suits is another military term. Unfortunately, no noddy suits were available for the support structure, that's the civilians. In November 1980, the Ministry of Defense discussed with Washington the possibility of acquiring American nerve gas weapons for Britain. Here are our NATO boys, after a nerve gas operation, playing a game called decontamination.
Go and sit down right here. Come on over here and sit down, both of you. Facing you? Yeah, face me, okay? You take your right boot off, you take your left boot off, okay? After you take your boots off, do not let your right boot touch the ground. Put it over that, okay? Take your left boot off. Take your right boot off, Ortegon. Now, when you pull that off, do not let your boot touch the ground. Put it on the other side of the bit. You understand? All right, boots off. Now do the same thing with your right boot.
Latest scores in this limited nuclear war are not yet in, but it does seem likely that our side has won, proving that a nuclear war can be fought and contained in Europe. Fortunately, it's all a game, a NATO war game. But such nuclear games are being played regularly in Europe as dehumanized rehearsals for the kind of limited nuclear war endorsed by NATO in December 1979, when the decision was taken to accept American-controlled cruise and Pershing missiles. The unthinkable is now the planned and the practiced.
Through early morning fog I see visions of the things to be, the pains that are withheld for me. I realize and I can see that suicide is painless. It brings on many changes, and I can take or leave it if I please.
One of the means of conditioning you, the public, to accept a nuclear arms race is secrecy and duplicity. That is, you're told one thing by government and the very opposite happens in secret. When the Labour Party was returned to power in 1974, its manifesto was clear on one issue. We have renounced, it said, any intention of moving to a new generation of strategic nuclear weapons. Indeed, Mr. Callaghan, on becoming Prime Minister, promised a full and informed debate on nuclear weapons. During 1978, a series of extraordinary meetings took place in the Cabinet Office in Whitehall. These meetings were convened by Mr. Callaghan and were attended by Foreign Secretary David Owen, Chancellor of the Exchequer Dennis Healey, Defence Secretary Fred Mulley, and senior civil servants from the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence. Parliament knew nothing about these meetings, nor did other members of the Cabinet. So secret was this committee that it didn't have a name or a number. It took the decision to spend £1,000 million to massively increase the British nuclear arsenal in what was called the Cheveline programme. This £1,000 million was buried without trace in civil service accounts, and no one questioned it. And of course you knew nothing about it.
Trident I, a powerful new three-stage missile with a range of 4,000 nautical miles, capable of delivering multiple warheads to widely scattered targets.
Britain's new so-called independent deterrent grew out of the Cheveline programme and is to be based on the American Trident missile. Trident is not a defensive nuclear weapon. It's designed to attack first. The Trident will cost around £8,000 million. The Ministry of Defence official who briefed me said, with Trident, you get more bang for a buck. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union cannot feed itself and conceals the growing poverty and hardship of its people. In the United States, unemployment in cities like Detroit and in the black ghettos is more than half the adult population, with malnutrition now officially recognized as a disease. In Britain, many of this generation may never work, and the closure of hospitals and schools is no longer news. In the 1980s, having nuclear weapons gives you more bang for a buck.
If the United Kingdom had no nuclear weapons, I think they'd be in a much stronger bargaining position. Now they're captive appendages to the United States' strategic and other nuclear weapons systems. You're just a little adjunct here of our total nuclear capability in the United States.
Well, there are contingency plans in the NATO doctrine to fire a nuclear weapon for demonstrative purposes, to demonstrate to the other side that they are exceeding the limits of toleration in the conventional area.
In November 1981, US Secretary of State General Alexander Haig revealed that NATO had a plan to fire a nuclear warning shot in a time of tension. In NATO's 1977 exercises, General Haig, then Supreme Commander, ordered a first nuclear strike. Only a dry run, of course.
I can never figure out from a military point of view or an economic point of view of why the Russians would want to make an attack in Europe or on the United States. The Russians are very late imperialists. They're lousy imperialists. They come in with a heavy hand and they blunder all over the place. I don't think they're going to be successful. But dumb they are not. And they'd have to be dumb to make a frontal attack in Europe. It'd be suicide for them, and they know that.
August the 17th, 1982, the Guardian newspaper reported that the Pentagon had completed a strategic master plan to give the United States the capability of winning a protracted nuclear war. August the 23rd, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger wrote to newspaper editors complaining that the media had got American war plans all wrong.
I wrote the letter to get an unfiltered and, from my parochial point of view, correct statement of what you're actually about in Washington. I was concerned because, rightly or wrongly, and without in any way attacking the credibility or accuracy of the press, I was concerned that the impression was being given that we had a large unit in the Pentagon that was assigned to fighting protracted nuclear wars, and that is totally wrong. We have not changed the American policy, strategic or otherwise, basically at all, but the Soviet capability has changed, and our policy has always been the same, that is to maintain an effective deterrent. And an effective deterrent against nuclear war has to be one that is correctly perceived by the Soviets as being strong enough to discourage and totally deter any kind of a nuclear attack. As their capability increases, we have to strengthen and modernize our capability, and that is the only policy in which we're engaged, and it's exactly the same policy on which every American government has been engaged since the end of World War II. It ought to be kept in proportion. We allocate something under 15% of our budget to strategic weapons and nuclear capabilities. In keeping with the unanimous agreement at the Bonn summit, we are spending the balance of our budget on strengthening and increasing our conventional capability. Again, not with the idea of launching a war or getting a protracted war or anything of the kind, but with the idea of deterring every war. It's the paradox of our time that all of the things we are trying to do in the Defense Department are focused totally and completely on preventing a war through deterrence. And if I'm completely successful in everything I'm trying to do, we'll never use any of the things we're trying to persuade the Congress we should and need to have.
Could I just follow that
Surely.
up? Because the fears in Europe arose particularly around last October, didn't they, when President Reagan was quoted as saying he could see where you could have the exchange of tactical weapons against troops in the field without it bringing either one of the major powers to pushing the button. Now, that sounds very much like nuclear war fighting. At the same around the same time, Secretary Haig talked about a demonstration shot of nuclear weapons.
I think you should set that in the context in which it was said. And the context in which it was said was a hypothetical question by a Midwest editor at a group of editors meeting at the White House. And the president, as always, trying to be very helpful in responding to all of the questions. And he gave a perfectly honest opinion, which I don't think anyone can had any particular quarrel with. It's the raising of the subject that seems to cause so much problem. And I noticed one article recently that was critical of my letter because it said I shouldn't be discussing the subject at all. Well, there's a great temptation not to discuss the subject, but sadly others aren't quite as self-restrained. The subject is being discussed, but it's being discussed, frankly, as I said in the letter, inaccurately.
The policy of nuclear deterrence, wrote Mr. Weinberger, has been approved through the political processes of the democratic nations it protects since at least 1950. That is a fine example of official truth. It implies that the West's nuclear policy evolved through the normal democratic checks and balances, when in fact the policy was conceived in utmost secrecy. Typical of this secrecy is the directive for plans to fight a protracted nuclear war, which, says the Guardian report, is part of a top-secret national security decision document that was drawn up in the autumn of 1981. President Reagan's strategic doctrine goes further towards accepting nuclear war as a practical option, in that it specifically states the goal of winning a protracted nuclear war.
The decision to use nuclear weapons in Europe is purely a U.S. decision. One of the great myths that's been perpetrated in Europe is that somehow the NATO countries, Chancellor Schmidt or the Prime Minister Thatcher, will have something to say about whether or not the U.S. uses nuclear weapons. They will not. Now, we may consult with them, and we may take their advice, and we may not. But if we decide to use nuclear weapons, there's nobody in Europe that could stop us.
Is the West our way of life?
The 1979 decision to deploy cruise missiles was to counter Soviet SS-20 missiles. That was the official reason given. What is seldom mentioned is that on the integrated battlefield of Western Europe, there is already nuclear artillery and nuclear mines and all manner of small, convenient nuclear weapons.
The purpose of having a war, let me rephrase that, the purpose of battle, whether we like it or not, is to destroy the enemy and keep yourself from being destroyed. Now, you want to have as efficient a weapons as you can in order to accomplish your mission. You keep pressing the technological and scientific community of your country, you see. Find us better ways to be more efficient on the battlefield to accomplish our mission. Now, that decision of 1979 reflected NATO's determination to do several things. One, to close the gap which we had in the spectrum of forces which we need in order to implement our strategy of flexible response. And secondly, to deny to the Soviet Union a sanctuary from which she could launch these kinds of weapons against Western Europe without fear of having retaliation upon her own soil from Western Europe.
First of all, these are American weapons under American control that are coming. But number two, they are a direct breach of the Khrushchev-Kennedy agreement, where it has been said there should be no such weapons stationed on the soil of allies. And these weapons, Pershing II and cruise missiles, have a completely new quality and cannot be compared to the SS-20 in our feeling, and will reach deeply into the Soviet Union. So in fact, they are there for first strike capability. And we feel that we have enough already on overkill in Europe, enough not land, but sea and air-based systems to combat any threat, even conventional forces. We feel this is completely an excess on nuclear weapons, and we also feel it's a whole new weapons generation, which we as Germans and as Europeans reject because it will mean limited nuclear war in Europe, and we will be the first victims.
General, why do you think increasing numbers of Europeans are frightened by the presence of NATO nuclear weapons in Europe?
Well, that's difficult for me to explain, you see, because I happen to believe that if we're going to deter, we have to deter at all levels, as I've said. And it seems to me that they tend to be more frightened of our stationing weapons or modernizing our weapon system in order to accomplish that mission of keeping them from being used by the Soviet Union, more frightened of that than they are frightened of those weapons which cause us to have to modernize in order to deter.
We reject all mass destruction weapons, also the SS-20, quite clear, because they endanger us, they point at us. But the Soviet Union is confronted, in fact, by two systems, by the intercontinental system of the United States and very soon by the medium-range missiles from Europe, whereas the SS-20 cannot reach the United States. It is just affecting the Allies. So there's a total imbalance.
Don't you understand the fear that people have for another increase in the number of nuclear arms?
Listen, young man, don't talk to me about fear of war. I've been in them. And let me tell you, as I've told you before, this group, it's a stupid way to do business. It's a folly, it's a waste. And nobody wants to go back to war. None of us. So all of us have that concern. But because we fear that there might be a war, doesn't mean we shouldn't take the steps necessary to keep there from being one.
All that which is claimed to defend us is going to destroy us. Because those weapons which are now being placed in Europe will in fact, perhaps that's my fear, call for a preemptive or preventive strike by the Soviet Union, because they are threatened outside of their own borders very much. And I believe the Americans make it a little bit too easy, because they can very much shove the problem away and say, we can make surgical strikes. These weapons are made for small strikes, for surgical strikes, and thus you could try to limit war, which is to me insane.
Historically, we put nuclear weapons in Europe, the United States did, in order to deter a Soviet ground attack, and in a sense to compensate for what we considered to be the superiority in numbers of Soviet troops over NATO troops. But when the Soviet Union developed the capability to provide nuclear weapons in Europe, it negated the capability of our nuclear weapons to deter a war. It put us into a war-fighting situation.
Soviet people are just as much afraid of us as we are probably of them. And yet we in Germany have a historic and moral mission, I believe, because we have started too many wars, and we have also made too much damage in the Soviet Union. 20 million people have died there because the Germans have started their war, have marched in. So we feel the mission must come from the people to start having another picture of these people. Because every time we're confronted by the Soviet Union, we see women, men, and children. We do not see armies. And we do not believe, truly do not believe, that the Russians will march in here overnight. We don't believe it. And if they did, we know we have enough conventional weapons, enough air and sea-based systems already in NATO to confront any threat. This total overkill capacity is totally insane, and we must start somewhere to stop it.
These are pictures from a BBC film called The War Game, made in 1965 and banned from showing on television. Then almost all the press supported the official reason for the ban, that the film was too horrible to show. The unofficial truth is revealed in this letter by Lord Normanbrook, then chairman of the BBC Governors, who wrote that the war game on television might have a significant effect on public attitudes towards the policy of nuclear deterrence. For many years afterwards, the nuclear debate languished. But last year, the greatest peaceful gatherings of people since World War II took place in Europe and the United States. Last June, almost 1 million people transformed New York. 72% of all Americans, said a poll, wanted a halt to all nuclear arms building. Those who accused European campaigners of being anti-American would now have to level the same charge at millions of Americans who, said one newspaper, are reclaiming our American democracy. Paul Warmke was senior negotiator in the strategic arms limitation talks known as SALT. You're one of those who have sat down over a long period of time with the Russians negotiating. Could you give us a glimpse of how the Russian leadership thinks?
I would say that I see them as being very interested in controlling nuclear arms. Not because of any sort of philanthropy or anything of that sort, but because they are genuinely afraid of nuclear war. As a matter of fact, nuclear war to them is perhaps a more real threat and a more real danger than it is to us.
Why is that?
Well, one thing, because of the fact that The last time there was military action on American territory was 120 years ago, and then it was Americans against Americans with muskets and cannonballs. Whereas the Soviets, of course, were major casualties of World War II.
Soviet overtures to us are invariably described as propaganda.
Yes.
How do we receive them? Are they to be believed, or are they, most of them, propaganda? How do you see them?
Well, in my own opinion, what we have to do is to find out whether they're serious or not. If it's a bluff, we ought to call the bluff. It might very well turn out not to be a bluff. But if they make this kind of an overture, and we do nothing in response except to say that it's propaganda, it seems to me what we do is to sow division within the Western alliance.
How could arms control in the 1980s be put into practice, in your view?
Well, really, I see nothing wrong with the process that's been going on, except for the fact that it's taken an inordinately long period of time. SALT I froze the number of strategic launchers. SALT II was designed to put an actual numerical ceiling, to begin reductions, and to begin the process of qualitative restrictions as well as quantitative restrictions. I say the only difficulty is that it's taken too long. Now, it's entirely feasible, entirely realistic, to say, okay, at this point, make a few cosmetic changes if you feel that you have to, so that you can call it SALT II.5, or the Reagan Treaty, and ratify it. And then move on, because once you've got that framework in place, then the opportunities are really vast. You could have, for example, a negotiation on theater nuclear force reductions. That could go on concurrently with negotiations on a bilateral basis between the United States and the Soviet Union to have further reductions, to extend the term of the treaty. By the end of 1981, the limit was supposed to be 2,250, which would require, as I've said earlier, that the Soviets eliminate some 250 to 300. Well, by the end of 1984, why not get down to 1,800? By the end of 1985, get down to something like 1,700 and extend the term of the treaty for another 5 years. You could have a negotiation of a ban on the flight testing of new missiles. We could proceed at the same time to complete the comprehensive test ban that would prevent any explosions of nuclear devices. At the present time, that just involves the United States, the Soviet Union, and England. But it could be expanded to bring in the French and the Chinese. And just in terms of proliferation, if the major nuclear powers could agree to a total stop of any nuclear explosions, that would, in my opinion, be the most powerful inhibition against anybody else getting into the nuclear weapons business. So that it's an entirely rational agenda. All we have is the question as to whether we have the political will to go ahead with it.
And does this U.S. administration genuinely want to negotiate?
I'm sure that there are some in the present administration that would genuinely like to see serious and effective arms control negotiations. There are, regrettably, others that think that it's a waste of time and that the only thing we can do with the Soviets is to outcompete them. And what they favor is what I've referred to as the arms race theory of arms control. That what we do is just go ahead as fast as we can with as much as we can in the expectation that they won't be able to keep up and that we'll get arms control by default. Well, I don't know of anybody who has been a serious student of the Soviet Union or of Russian history who believes that that would take place. They would do whatever is necessary in order to match us, so that the race for strategic superiority is a recipe for disaster. We'll be bankrupt if we aren't obliterated. How many doctors are going to survive? How many urban hospital facilities are going to survive? What do you do with all the bodies? What are the epidemic consequences? What are the fallout consequences? The idea that you can fight, survive, and win a nuclear war is calamitous nonsense.
This arms race has gone on for a long time, and I think we need to slow it, stop it, and reverse it. And I think the time for that is right now.
People are beginning to ask questions about secrecy, about security. and beginning to feel that if we are a democracy, then we the people ought to be able to say what sort of defence policy we want.
When we set out to make this film almost 2 years ago, opponents of the nuclear arms race were still being dismissed as outside the popular consensus, as extreme or naive or even pro-Soviet. Today, opinion polls show that a clear majority of the people of Britain are against cruise missiles on our soil. These are to be deployed throughout Western Europe this year, and we may have no control over them, and they may well undermine our last chance of avoiding a new and final stage in the nuclear arms race. But are governments listening to the common sense of their own people, or are they merely concerned with spreading new propaganda, as if wanting peace now is somehow unpatriotic? We were told we went to war in the Falklands over the issue of sovereignty. Is not surrendering control of missiles on our own soil also surrendering sovereignty? Even the so-called dual control is a propaganda term, designed to make the missiles more acceptable, but no safer. Certainly, more and more people are asking, impatiently and rationally, why over the years we have allowed this country to become a prime target, and more people, regardless of their political beliefs, are understanding that the Russians, like us, have every reason not to fight a nuclear war. You heard Paul Warnke, the American strategic arms negotiator, say that a rational agenda of disarmament was not only possible, but would work, and that to dismiss out of hand the overtures now coming from Moscow would only bring us even closer to war. In America recently, an historic motion to freeze the nuclear arms race was only narrowly defeated in the Congress. In spite of our own insidious propaganda and secrecy, we live in a democracy and the Russian people do not. Surely then, it is we who can and should take the initiative. Nuclear weapons were never an act of God. Nothing is inevitable.